Tonight we slip into the golden haze of a desert evening, the kind where the sun dips low and spills its last rays like molten brass across the dunes. The sand shifts in restless waves, and ahead of you rises a shape, low, squat, yet inviting. A tea house, perched at the edge of the Taklamakan desert, its plaster walls glowing faintly in the fading light. You can almost hear the clink of cups even before the doorway frames itself around your tired body. It's quiet enough that the wind whistles louder than any chatter, and still, you're pulled closer. You probably won't survive this journey, if we're being brutally honest, between the bandits, the thirst, and that suspiciously grumpy-looking camel behind you, but hey, that's the fun of imaginary travel. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now, dim the lights, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You push the creaking door open, and warmth rushes out, carrying the unmistakable perfume of steeping leaves. Steam curls upward, curling and vanishing into the rafters as if it, too, is weary from traveling so far. A weary merchant mutters into his cup, the glaze on the pottery worn smooth by years of palms just like yours. The benches are low, carved from cedar dragged here on muleback, and the cushions are sun-bleached but soft, like clouds that forgot how to float. The tea doesn't taste like the supermarket box waiting at home. No, this one strikes you first with bitterness, earthy as rain-soaked soil, and only then a hidden sweetness creeps up the back of your throat. The leaves might have come from Yunnan, hundreds of miles away, carried in compressed bricks wrapped in bamboo. They could have been roasted over tiny hearths by women who never once saw the desert that now holds their harvest. Historians still argue whether tea first entered Central Asia strictly as a medicinal tonic or whether it arrived alongside silk simply as another desirable luxury. Either way, by the time it reaches your lips, the drink feels less like a beverage and more like a whispered pact. You've joined the club of countless travelers pausing here, cups steaming in tired hands. The desert outside does not care if you're thirsty. It stretches infinite, swallowing footprints within minutes, hiding oases like mischievous children playing hide and seek. You glance through the doorway again, seeing dunes swell like waves, the heat clinging even as night begins to pry open the horizon. A joke runs through your head: the desert has more sand than Starbucks has lattes, and honestly, both are equally overpriced when you're desperate. Inside, though, time thickens. The tea house breathes differently than the world outside. You notice an old brass kettle balanced on a bed of coals, hissing faintly with a sound that could almost pass for cicadas. A cat wins between legs, clearly the real owner here, while the merchant in the corner snores with all the dramatic flair of a traveling bard who never learned to play softly. The tea master, because every tea house worth remembering has one, emerges from behind a counter. His robe is simple, patched at the elbows, but his movements carry an elegance sharp enough to make you sit straighter. With one hand he tips hot water into fresh cups, letting the steam rise like banners of surrender, and with the other he sprinkles dried rose petals into the brew. The petals float, scarlet fragments against amber liquid, reminding you that not all treasures sparkle. Here's a mainstream historical fact for you. Along the Silk Roads, tea houses often functioned as unofficial embassies. Merchants would seal deals here, monks would debate doctrine here, and weary caravanners would trust these spaces as safe grounds where weapons were, at least theoretically, lowered. It wasn't just about tea. It was about neutral ground. And here's a quirkier tidbit. Some tea houses near desert fringes supposedly charged travelers by the shade, not the drink. You'd buy the right to sit beneath their awning for a handful of coins, while the tea itself flowed free. Imagine explaining that to your accountant. Your cup is empty now, but the warmth lingers. You shift on the cushion, sighing as the air grows cooler. Somewhere far in the distance, a camel bell rings dull, hollow, like an echo of time itself. Maybe it signals another caravan arriving, their footsteps soon to press into the dust of this threshold. Or maybe it's just the wind pretending to have company. Your eyelids flutter heavier than before. The tea house does that, stretches time like dough until minutes feel like hours and hours slip away like grains of sand. You let your head fall back, half listening to the rustle of the door, the clink of ceramic, the hiss of that old brass kettle, and realize that if history is written in ink, then here it's written in steam. The lamps glow dimmer as the evening folds deeper, their flames tugged gently by the desert drafts that slip through cracks in the plaster walls. You step further into the tea house, where the floor dips into a shallow sunken space lined with thick carpets. Their patterns are hypnotic, geometric knots of red, indigo, and gold that catch at your eyes like constellations stitched into wool. You try not to trip over the edge, though the cushions scattered across the floor look as though they were placed precisely for clumsy newcomers. Every footstep is hushed here, swallowed by woven fabric. Even the scrape of a chair leg is muted by rugs layered so heavily that you can't tell where one ends and the next begins. Outside, the desert is still an orchestra of silence and shifting sand, but inside the tea house you hear the softer chorus, the low murmurs of voices, the occasional chuckle, the splash of hot water poured from a height with deliberate grace. The quiet doesn't feel empty, it feels curated, like the host himself has arranged the space to coax peace out of tired bodies. One lamp flickers above your head, its glass smoked dark from decades of oil flames. You can smell the tang of sesame oil in its wick, faint but present, and you realize it's not meant to blind anyone with brightness. It's meant to slow your heartbeat. Soft light is a kind of magic, after all, the sort that convinces even the most suspicious traveler to let down their guard. You make a mental note: if you ever open your own tea house, you'll make sure no one can see enough to notice how often you dust. A woman draped in a shawl embroidered with tiny mirrors lowers herself onto the cushion beside you. She doesn't speak at first, just stares at the lamp as though it has answers. Finally she exhales and mutters, "The oil costs more than the tea." You can't tell if it's a complaint or a joke, but you nod like a fellow conspirator. It reminds you of the odd fact that sometimes, along the trade routes, fuel for lamps or stoves cost more than food itself. Historians still argue whether this scarcity drove some merchants to travel at night under starlight alone, conserving precious oil, or whether that's just a romantic exaggeration invented by later storytellers. The carpets under your palm are thick and soft, but not luxurious in the modern sense. They're practical warmth when nights plunge toward freezing, padding when bones ache after weeks on camelback. Yet every one of them carries artistry, hand-tied knots that represent whole villages' identities. One merchant across the room unrolls a new piece onto the floor, its blue so deep it feels like staring into twilight. He wants to sell it, but even before anyone speaks you can sense the pattern has more value than the price tag. Carpets weren't just commodities here, they were portable art galleries, prayer mats, family heirlooms, sometimes even currency. Imagine slapping a rug down on the counter at Starbucks and asking if it covers your latte bill. You reach for your cup again and notice the surface of the table, it's scratched from years of bowls, blades, dice, and impatient hands drumming. Travelers have left grooves in the wood as permanent as signatures. Some carvings even peek out, tiny symbols, names, maybe a hidden love story etched with a pocket knife. The quiet of the tea house lets these details hum louder, like secrets eager to be noticed. A shadow shifts near the corner. A boy no older than 12 sneaks between cushions, collecting empty cups with the efficiency of someone who has learned to make themselves invisible. He carries a tray so dented it reflects like a funhouse mirror, but his hands are steady. The boy winks at you when he sees your gaze, then vanishes back into the kitchen. You're not sure if you've been recruited into some unspoken alliance or if he just enjoys unsettling guests. There's another layer of silence here, not the absence of sound, but the absence of hurry. Nobody checks a clock. Nobody scrolls a screen. The pace is measured by how long it takes steam to fade from a cup, or how slowly an oil lamp guttering in its glass reminds everyone that time is nothing more than fuel running out. You wonder, briefly, whether modern cafes are secretly jealous of this timelessness, no matter how many playlists they load onto the speakers. And here's your quirky tidbit for this room. Some tea houses along the Silk Roads reportedly laid carpets upside down in storm season. The thick weave on the backside trapped dust better, saving travelers from breathing in entire sand dunes every time the door opened. So if you find yourself coughing into your sleeve here, maybe check which way the rug's been flipped. You lean back, feeling your muscles unclench in the glow of the low lamps and the hush of the carpets. The woman beside you has already drifted into a half-sleep, her shawl slipping from her shoulders. The tea master moves like a shadow between tables, refilling cups with the patience of someone who knows that most conversations will be forgotten, but the sensation of calm will linger. And then, just at the edge of hearing, a thread of laughter rises from a group of traders, stitched quickly into the fabric of quiet. It doesn't break the peace. It folds into it. Like spice stirred into broth, it belongs. You sip what's left in your cup, and for a moment the desert, the dangers, even the very notion of travel feel far away, as if the carpets have unrolled themselves not just beneath your feet, but across your thoughts. Your cup is warm again, though you don't quite remember the hand that refilled it. The tea inside this time is darker, almost ink black, and its scent is sharp with something roasted. You lift it to your lips and take a cautious sip. The flavor lands heavy, bitter at first, like bark steeped too long, but then a subtle sweetness unfurls, as though the leaves waited until the last possible moment to reveal their secret. It's not the kind of drink you gulp, it's one you negotiate with. Clay cups line the shelf behind the counter, each slightly misshapen, each marked by the thumbprint of a potter who probably never set foot outside his village. They aren't mass-produced, they're survivors, chipped yet sturdy, meant to be held, warmed, and trusted. Your cup feels alive in your hands, as though it has heard thousands of conversations and chosen to keep them all. You trace the uneven glaze, thinking about how these vessels must have ridden caravans, clinking together in wooden crates cushioned with straw, destined for places their makers couldn't imagine. Tea itself traveled no less perilously. Compressed into bricks, packed tight in bamboo, wrapped in hide, it rode on the backs of camels, yaks, and sometimes desperate merchants who shouldered the bundles themselves when animals faltered. Historians still argue whether bricks of tea served more as beverage cargo or as an unofficial currency, exchanged for salt, horses, even protection from soldiers at checkpoints. Either way, you're sipping the world's strangest form of money, liquefied into warmth. A traveler at the next table, his beard frosted with desert dust, raises his own cup and mutters, "Better than melted snow." You chuckle under your breath. He's not wrong. In these lands, tea wasn't just refreshment, it was survival. Its caffeine warded off exhaustion, its warmth pushed back the creeping chill of desert nights. Add in a pinch of salt or a dollop of butter, and suddenly you had calories enough to face another day. Tibetan nomads swore by it. You, however, still find the idea of butter in tea slightly suspicious, like dropping a stick of butter into your morning latte. But hey, don't knock it till you've sipped it. The tea master sets a new pot on the coals. This one hisses more angrily, steam sputtering as though the leaves themselves protest their fate. He pours from a height, the liquid arcing in a ribbon before slapping into a row of cups. Some of the splash darkens the wood, staining it in rings that look like little eclipses. You wonder how many thousands of those rings overlap, invisible layers of history varnished into the tabletop. Quirky tidbit for the night: archaeologists once discovered bricks of ancient tea in a Han Dynasty tomb, compressed so tightly that even centuries underground couldn't erase their scent. Imagine that, a ghostly perfume wafting out of a burial chamber, a reminder that even emperors couldn't go into the afterlife without their favorite brew. The bearded traveler begins to hum under his breath, and another joins him, turning the murmur into a song. Their voices are rough, like sandpaper against silk, but the tune is steady. You can't understand the words, though you catch names of rivers and mountains. It dawns on you that many of these songs doubled as maps, mnemonics to guide travelers across deserts and steppes long before paper maps were reliable. When someone sang, "Cross the yellow river where the reeds bend low," it wasn't poetry. It was directions disguised as art. You swirl the tea again, watching leaves cling stubbornly to the sides of the cup. The bitterness softens as it cools, the sweetness brightening, almost honeyed. You think of modern tea bags, uniform and predictable, and realize they lack the drama of this clay cup, the uncertainty, the shifting taste, the sense that every sip is slightly different, slightly alive. The man beside you leans closer and grins, teeth flashing. "Leaves from mountains far away," he whispers, "but brewed with water that remembers this desert." You blink, unsure if it's philosophy or just the rambling of someone tipsy on tannins. Either way, he's right. The drink is both foreign and local, a marriage of distant harvests and immediate necessity. A draft snakes under the door, carrying a chill sharper than the tea's bitterness. You tug your cloak tighter and sip again. The room has grown quieter, as though everyone feels the night deepening. The flames in the lamps burn lower, each wick curling black at its tip. Yet your cup glows faintly when you lift it, amber against the gloom, like a lantern cradled in your hands. Somewhere beyond the walls, a jackal howls, the sound thin and hungry. The tea house doesn't flinch. It simply breathes, cups steaming, carpets muffling, lamps glowing. And you sit there, clay in your hands, bitter leaves on your tongue, part of a ritual that has outlived kings and caravans alike. The door creaks again, and a gust of colder air swirls dust across the threshold. You glance up, half expecting another weary camel driver, but this time it's a group of merchants pushing through, their voices already tumbling over each other in waves of laughter. They drag in the scent of leather, sweat, and spice, and suddenly the tea house feels less like a sleepy haven and more like a stage. Their arrival paints the air with the rustle of silk bolts and the clinking of clay jars set carefully near the entrance. You turn your head just enough to spy what they've brought, shimmering rolls of fabric stacked like treasure. Even in the dim glow of the lamps, the silks catch the light like water, glimmering blues, greens, and silvers that seem to ripple when touched. A merchant in a turban unfurls a length with a flourish, and the fabric sighs into a puddle of shine across the rug. For a second, you can almost hear the murmur of looms in far-off China, threads being drawn and tightened by hands that will never know this desert in. Beside the silk, another man opens a clay jar, and instantly the air sharpens with saffron, golden threads that look like nothing but dust and yet smell like wealth itself. He grins at his companions, sprinkling a few strands into his palm before tucking them back like a gambler shuffling cards. You don't have to be a spice expert to realize that saffron was worth its weight in silver, sometimes more. It's the sort of seasoning that could elevate a humble pot of rice into a banquet. Or, if you were less noble, it could elevate your wallet by a week's worth of meals. A younger merchant pulls out another jar and tips it toward the lamplight. The scent of cinnamon floods the air, warm and sweet, and for an absurd second you think of holiday cookies back home. History is funny like that, scents tie centuries together, proving that human beings have always been united by their sweet tooth. Historians still argue whether these tea houses were primarily marketplaces with hot drinks or sanctuaries with a side of trade. Were they meeting grounds for contracts? Or rest stops that just happened to attract merchants with pockets full of goods? The evidence is murky, but the truth probably rests somewhere in between, a space where coins and cups clinked with equal weight. You notice a man near the door slip a small object into another's palm. It's quick, casual, and could easily be overlooked, but your imagination kicks in. Maybe it's a vial of crushed lapis pigment for an artist, or a carved amulet said to guard against desert spirits. Or maybe it's just a bribe for tomorrow's caravan guard, insurance against sticky fingers in the night. You smirk into your tea. Not all history makes it into the textbooks. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some travelers swore that merchants at these tea houses used coded hand signals, tapping cups, or tugging beards in certain ways to indicate prices or warnings. Was it an early form of secret stock exchange? Or just itchy chins and restless fingers misinterpreted by outsiders? Nobody can prove it, but the rumor alone is enough to make you watch more closely. The noise of the merchants rises and falls like waves. One brags about silk prices in Samarkand, another jokes about spices spoiling in the heat, and a third sighs dramatically about a camel that decided, halfway across the desert, to sit down and retire permanently. You grin despite yourself. Somewhere, surely, a camel is still living its best life as a stubborn lawn ornament. A tray of fresh cups makes its way to their table. The tea master pours swiftly, letting the steam curl between jars of saffron and bolts of silk. The merchants drink between bargains, pausing only to smack their lips or wave their cups for refills. It strikes you then, deals that shaped empires may have been sealed not in gilded halls but right here, in small rooms softened by carpets and tea steam. You shift on your cushion and glance at the silk again. Its surface glows even in this low light, a reminder that luxury doesn't need sunlight to shine. You think about how many hands will touch that cloth before it reaches some palace wardrobe, how many mouths will taste the saffron before it perfumes a royal kitchen. And in between, tea houses like this one witness it all, humble rest stops that quietly stitch together the grand tapestry of the Silk Roads. The saffron jars have been tucked away, the silks carefully rolled again, and the merchants now slump back against the cushions, their voices fading to murmurs. In the quieter rhythm of the room, another sound emerges, low, steady, almost like chanting. You follow it with your eyes and spot a pair of monks seated near the far wall, saffron robes pooling like spilled sunlight on the carpets. Their heads are shaved, their spines straight, and their hands cradle cups as if the tea itself were part of a sacred ritual. They speak softly, their words carrying the cadence of prayer more than conversation. One unfurls a small bundle, and inside lies a scroll, its edges frayed, ink smudged by countless hands. He smooths it across the table, tracing lines with a careful finger. You lean just enough to see the script, strange curves, unfamiliar characters that look like dancing flames. Perhaps it's Buddhist sutra, or perhaps a pilgrim's notes from some distant monastery. Historians still argue whether many of these texts were carried as sacred duty, or if some were just clever merchants disguising trade records as holy writings to escape taxes. The younger monk glances up, and his eyes meet yours. They shine with the kind of calm that could annoy you if you weren't so tired yourself. He smiles faintly, then returns to his cup, inhaling the steam as though it alone could carry him closer to enlightenment. Pilgrims gather too, scattered among the cushions. You catch sight of a woman with dust-caked sandals, clutching a wooden charm strung on a cord. She kisses it before every sip, whispering words you can't hear. Another man, older and hunched, keeps pulling a tiny pouch from his robe, checking it like one might check a wallet. Inside, you suspect, are pebbles from a sacred river, each one proof of a step already taken. Here's your mainstream fact. The Silk Roads weren't just about goods, they were arteries for belief. Buddhism spread across these deserts largely because monks and pilgrims traveled in caravans, stopping at tea houses and monasteries alike. Ideas moved with the same momentum as silk bolts and spice jars, weaving faith into trade. And now for the quirky tidbit. Some pilgrims supposedly carried little clay Buddhas shaped like pocket charms. They'd leave them behind in tea houses as blessings, like an ancient version of leaving a Yelp review, except way more spiritual. Imagine sipping tea, glancing up, and realizing a tiny serene figurine is staring you down from the shelf. The monks sip slowly, as if dragging time itself across their tongues. Their discipline is almost contagious, You find yourself holding your own cup differently, more reverently, like maybe the leaves hold more than caffeine. The air around them seems to hum, and you wonder if the tea house walls remember centuries of chants, each one layering another thin coat of holiness on the plaster. A group of merchants nearby watch the monks too, but with impatience. One mutters about routes, another about caravan fees. They're practical men, weighing risk against profit. Yet, even they grow quieter as the monks begin to chant low syllables, rhythmic and endless, filling the tea house like the pulse of a sleeping heart. The tea master doesn't interrupt. He moves silently, refilling cups, clearing bowls, but never stepping into the circle of sound. You realize this too is part of the tea house's role, not just a rest stop, not just a market, but a crossroads of belief and doubt, of holy whispers and worldly bargains. Your head grows heavier as you listen. Maybe it's the warmth of the tea, maybe it's the chant thrumming against your ribs, or maybe it's simply exhaustion from the imagined miles behind you. You smile at the thought. Even your imagination gets tired. You close your eyes for a second, half expecting to wake to a monk's blessing, half fearing you'll wake to find your shoes missing. When you open them again, the scroll is rolled up, tucked away like a secret. The monks rise, bow to no one in particular, and slip into the night. The pilgrims follow, quieter than they arrived, leaving behind only the faintest echo of devotion. You look around the tea house, realizing it's just a little emptier, just a little quieter, as though belief itself has walked out into the desert. The tea house exhales into silence again, but not for long. From the back room, a sound threads its way forward, thin, wavering at first, then fuller as it finds courage. A lute, plucked with a patient hand, sends notes skipping across the air. They land softly on the rugs, slide along the beams, and settle like feathered shadows across your shoulders. Moments later, a reed flute joins in, its voice breathy and winding, like the desert wind funneled into song. You tilt your head, letting the music guide you. It's not polished in the concert hall sense. There are pauses, tiny hesitations where the player adjusts grip or clears their throat. But that imperfection is the charm. This is music born of road dust and campfires, of miles endured and stories gathered. You imagine it carrying through desert camps at night, camels shifting in the dark while men hummed along, grateful for melody in the emptiness. The tea master doesn't announce the musicians, doesn't dim the lamps dramatically. He just lets the sound exist, like another form of steam rising from the cups. Some travelers barely look up, already too accustomed. Others, like you, lean into it, eyes closed, caught in the net of strings and breath. Mainstream fact time: tea houses often doubled as performance spaces. Poets, musicians, even dancers found audiences here, where travelers carried tales from city to city. Entertainment wasn't just indulgence, it was news, culture, propaganda, sometimes even coded warnings tucked into verse. One song could teach a caravan the rumors of the road faster than a week of gossip. And here's the quirky tidbit: some musicians deliberately strung their instruments with mismatched gut, creating uneven tones said to mimic camel bells. Imagine paying to hear a lute that sounds like livestock. Yet, if you've ever missed the strange comfort of those hollow chimes after weeks on the trail, maybe it feels like home. The flute carries the lead now, winding upward like smoke from incense sticks burning somewhere unseen. A faint sweetness rides the air, resin or frankincense, you're not sure, and it twirls with the melody until you can't tell which is sound and which is scent. A merchant taps his cup in rhythm, another hums along with no regard for key, and the cat, the actual ruler of this establishment, flicks its tail like a conductor's baton. Historians still argue whether these performances were paid entertainment or spontaneous offerings from travelers seeking a free bed. Records blur fact with anecdote, but the idea remains the same: music made the desert survivable. It filled the hollow spaces left by endless horizons. You sip your tea, realizing the bitterness has softened now, or maybe your tongue has simply surrendered. Either way, the cup feels heavier when paired with song. The lute player, a man with silver threaded through his beard, looks like he's carried the instrument across half the known world. His fingers don't stumble even when the tempo quickens, a cascade of notes tumbling like a desert storm rolling over dunes. The flute follows, then drops away, leaving the strings to fade into a whisper. The silence after is just as loud as the music itself, stretching across the room like a held breath. A boy claps once, too loudly, earning a glare from his father. You smirk, because honestly, you were about to clap too. Instead, you settle for a quiet nod, acknowledging the players as they melt back into the shadows. The tea house resumes its low murmur, but the music lingers in your bones. You wonder if centuries from now, archaeologists will dig up instruments in desert ruins and imagine these very nights. Or maybe they'll just find the cat's paw prints baked into the floor tiles and misinterpret them as a lost alphabet. Stranger mistakes have been made. The notes of the flute still hover faintly in your ears when the door sighs open again. This time it isn't laughter or chanting that drifts in but the clinking of bells, slow and deliberate. A caravan has paused nearby, and you hear the muffled shuffle of hooves on sand, the deep grunt of camels lowering themselves to rest. The sound filters into the tea house like a lullaby made of metal and breath. You shift closer to the doorway, cup in hand, drawn by the rhythm. The desert outside has already swallowed the last of the sun, leaving only a sprawl of stars stitched across black silk. The air tastes sharper now, cooler, as though the dunes themselves exhale once the heat dies. You stand where firelight from inside meets starlight from above, and for a moment, it feels like two worlds pressing against each other, one domestic, one infinite. Camel bells jingle in uneven patterns, sometimes clashing, sometimes harmonizing. They're not ornamental, they're GPS, 7th century edition. A caravan moving in the dark relied on them to stay together, each animal marked with a slightly different tone. Lose the sound, lose the caravan. Lose the caravan, well, let's just say the desert doesn't write forgiveness letters. Mainstream fact, the Taklamakan was nicknamed the desert you enter and never leave. Travelers hugged its edges rather than cross its heart, following strings of oases like lifelines. Tea houses on those fringes were beacons, last gulps of humanity before the sands stretched out hungry and endless. You feel the weight of that nickname now, listening to bells fade into the distance, each chime a promise that someone, at least, is not lost. The quirky tidbit. Some merchants swore the bells carried protective magic, their tones scaring away desert spirits said to trick travelers into walking circles until they collapsed. Were the spirits real? Or just hallucinations from dehydration? Historians still argue whether those legends were supernatural warnings or clever parental scare tactics to keep apprentices from wandering off. Behind you, someone coughs and shuts the door halfway, muttering about letting in the cold. You remain, shoulders leaning against the frame, savoring the crisp air. Stars above sprawl impossibly bright. You try to name constellations, but the desert has its own maps, patterns of stars that guided caravans long before Greek myths were attached to them. Somewhere, a guide is probably pointing out which glittering dots lead toward Kasha, which toward Samarkand. You just admire how they burn steady, indifferent to whether anyone survives the journey beneath them. The bells grow fainter now, swallowed by dunes. The sound leaves a hollow quiet in its wake, one that makes your heartbeat feel louder than it should. You glance back inside. The carpets still cushion, the lamps still glow, the kettle still hisses. Yet standing here at the threshold, you realize the tea house is both sanctuary and watchtower, its door frame a fragile barrier between vast nothingness and fragile warmth. You take another sip, the tea now lukewarm but comforting. For a second, you imagine yourself as one of those bells, your voice drifting through desert darkness, tethered to others so you don't vanish into silence. The thought lingers as you finally step back inside, pulling the door closed, and letting the stars wait without you. The door shuts, muting the desert into silence, but the air inside still hums with restless energy. A group of travelers cluster around a low table near the far wall, their shadows bending and stretching in the lamplight. They're not drinking, not laughing. They're bent over parchment scraps and flatboards, sketching in charcoal and scratching with ink. Maps, rough and improvised, spread across the cushions like treasure spilled from a chest. You drift closer, curiosity tugging you along. The table is littered with half-finished routes, dotted lines wandering into nothing, circles marking rumored wells, jagged squiggles that might be mountains or someone's poor attempt at camels. One man jabs his finger into the parchment. Here, he insists, tapping a patch of blank space. There's water. I saw it myself. The others groan, clearly unconvinced. Historians still argue whether these hand-drawn maps ever held real accuracy, or if they were more like confidence tricks, tools to impress nervous companions rather than navigate with precision. The smell of ink mingles with the smoke of oil lamps. A woman leans over, brushing back her veil, and begins to redraw a line with more certainty than the others. She presses her charcoal so hard it nearly tears the parchment. "The well is here," she says firmly. "I filled my skin there." Another traveler snorts. "Or maybe you filled it from a mirage." The group erupts in weary laughter, the kind that masks fear with humor. You sip from your cup, warm liquid grounding you, and realize how much rides on these messy lines. Entire caravans trusted scraps of ink to keep them alive. There were no GPS satellites, no neat road signs. Just memory, rumor, and whatever detail someone managed to sketch before the parchment curled in the desert heat. Mainstream fact: merchants often relied on oral tradition as much as physical maps. Experienced guides memorized routes like sacred scripture, reciting landmarks and distances to apprentices who would one day do the same. Sometimes those guides exaggerated, puffing themselves up with tales of impossible shortcuts or legendary wells. Knowledge, after all, was currency as valuable as silk. Here's your quirky tidbit: some maps weren't on parchment at all but carved into wooden tablets or even knotted cords. Imagine fumbling with a pocket full of string, trying to remember if 3 knots meant turn left or prepare to die of thirst. One of the men slams his fist on the table, rattling cups. "The desert moves," he growls. "Dunes swallow landmarks. What was true last season isn't true this one." He's right, and the others nod, though none of them like it. The desert is a living thing, reshaping itself just to keep travelers humble. A dune you climbed yesterday could be gone tomorrow, replaced by a valley of shifting sand. No map can capture that. They argue on, voices overlapping. You notice one detail: none of them are eager to claim certainty. Each insists, argues, redraws, but each also looks over their shoulder as if afraid the desert itself might overhear and punish arrogance. The tea house walls absorb it all: the scratching charcoal, the muttered curses, the uneasy laughter. The tea master approaches quietly, placing fresh cups along the edge of their map. He doesn't scold them for staining parchment with tea rings, doesn't flinch at the raised voices. He knows this, too, is the role of the tea house: a cartography of survival written in steam and ink, drawn not just on paper but in memory, fear, and hope. You pull your cloak tighter, listening to the rise and fall of their debate. In another century, their arguments may be forgotten, their maps disintegrated. But for tonight, they're cartographers of the impossible, sketching safety into existence one doubtful line at a time. The arguments at the map table dwindle into tired sighs, and slowly the travelers recline against cushions, surrendering to silence. The tea house grows softer again, as though it breathes with the rise and fall of voices, swelling and ebbing like waves. And into that hush, a new current flows, stories, low and meandering, slipping from one table to the next like smoke curling under a door. A grey-bearded man begins it, speaking not to anyone in particular but to the air itself. Once, he says, there was a caravan that chased a mirage so far they found a city of glass beneath the dunes. A few listeners chuckle knowingly. Mirages are common here, shimmering lakes that vanish when you approach. But his tone suggests something more. He leans in, eyes glittering. The city had towers sharp as knives, streets paved in silver dust. And when they drank from its fountains, they forgot their own names. You sip from your clay cup, amused and unsettled at once. The tea tastes almost metallic now, though maybe that's your imagination echoing his tale. Historians still argue whether certain lost cities mentioned in records were ever real or just the grown-up versions of campfire ghost stories, designed to keep restless apprentices in line. Another traveler, this one younger, counters with his own tale. My grandfather swore the desert is alive, that it swallows kingdoms when they grow too proud. He told me once there was a palace here, right where this tea house stands. Marble floors, jade statues, the works. But the dunes got jealous, so they buried it overnight. The merchants laugh, but nervously. No one in a desert laughs too hard at the idea of being swallowed whole. Your quirky tidbit for the night. Some people believed dunes made actual noises, deep humming or booming, like drums hidden under the sand. Modern scientists explain it as grains rubbing against each other, but back then, people thought it was the voices of giants trapped below, or spirits warning travelers to turn back. You imagine being out there in the dark, hearing the desert hum at you, and suddenly Yelp reviews from clay Buddhas sound comforting. You lean into the stories, lulled by the rhythm of voices. One woman swears she saw ghost fires flicker in the distance, blue flames dancing on the horizon with no wood, no fuel. Another insists those weren't ghosts but treasure markers, left by raiders to lure greedy men into traps. Both possibilities sound equally unappealing to you, though the treasure part does tempt for half a second. The tea master doesn't interrupt. He moves between tables, pouring quietly, listening with the same patience he gave the monks and musicians. Maybe he's heard these stories 1,000 times. Or maybe he collects them like currency, each one a thread in the long fabric of the tea house itself. You sip again, and the bitterness has mellowed into something rich, almost smoky. The stories, too, mellow into drowsy murmurs. People laugh less, yawn more. You catch fragments, an oasis where birds speak in riddles, a caravan cursed by a scorpion the size of a dog, a king who ordered every grain of sand counted before he'd marry his daughter off. Somewhere between ridiculous and believable, the line blurs, and you realize that's the point. Stories here are survival tools. They fill the long nights, they pass the hours when fear might otherwise settle in. Outside, the wind sighs over the dunes, and for one dizzy moment you almost believe the voices of giants might be humming along. You shake your head, chuckling under your breath. If you're already half believing, then maybe the desert is winning. You tip back the last of your tea, grateful that at least the warmth in your belly feels real. The stories fade into quiet murmurs, and the tea master arrives with trays of food. Flatbreads still warm from a small oven, spiced lamb in clay bowls, and clay jars of wine cooled by desert night. The aroma rolls across the room, weaving itself around rugs and lamps, binding the space with a comforting, almost intoxicating sense of home. You reach for a piece of bread, breaking it into uneven chunks, and dip it into lamb stew that smells as if it absorbed centuries of spice roots. Each bite reminds you that nourishment on the Silk Roads wasn't just about survival, it was about adaptation. Merchants brought recipes from far-off lands, travelers added local herbs, and over time, dishes evolved to satisfy both weary bodies and homesick hearts. Historians still argue whether dishes like this lamb stew were strictly regional or had already traveled hundreds of miles, morphing with every hand that stirred the pot. Regardless, you take a bite, and the warmth spreads through you like slow-motion sunlight. A merchant pours wine into a clay cup, tilting it until the deep red liquid catches the lamp's glow. The wine tastes faintly of clay, a mineral note that makes it unmistakably local, even if the grapes were grown elsewhere. He raises his cup to his companions with a grin, the kind that says, "If the desert doesn't kill us, we'll be fine." You almost raise yours in response, though your cup is already empty. Quirky tidbit: some tea houses in the desert reportedly used wine not only as drink but as disinfectant. Travelers would rinse utensils or even small wounds with it, proving that alcohol's virtues extend far beyond simple inebriation. You tip the last of your cup back and smile at the clever efficiency of necessity. Between bites, the conversation drifts from caravans to curious local customs. Someone mentions a village where bread was baked with camel dung for fuel. Your stomach hesitates, but the stew and wine make you consider that humans are resourceful, or maybe just desperate. You laugh softly, realizing that taste is as much courage as it is appetite. Outside, the night stretches across the desert, stars watching silently as if judging each morsel. Camel bells echo faintly from distant dunes, their irregular cadence a reminder that life continues beyond the warm walls. You glance at the maps left earlier on a nearby table, half curious if someone will use tonight's meal as a negotiation tactic tomorrow. "I'll trade this bread for your safest route," they might joke. The tea house hums with a rhythm all its own, sips, bites, murmurs, clinks. Each sound is a stitch in the fabric of this fragile desert community, and you realize the simplicity of a meal becomes an entire ecosystem here. Food is more than sustenance, it's conversation, negotiation, comfort, and celebration all rolled into one. A poet seated near the hearth clears his throat, the smell of burning herbs curling around him. "A toast," he says, "to bread that survives the oven, wine that survives the clay, and travelers who survive the desert." You lift your own cup again, whether in solidarity or habit, and savor that fleeting moment of communion between total strangers, strangers who, for tonight, share not just a meal but a heartbeat in common. The stew now nearly gone, your hands rest on the warm clay cup. The laughter and conversation wind down, but the memory of taste, of spice, of wine, lingers. You can almost feel the centuries of meals that came before, the ghosts of cooks and merchants whose hands shaped not only food but the subtle rituals of survival. And in that quiet, you sense the desert itself observing, approving perhaps, or merely indifferent. From across the hearth, a poet begins to recite. His voice is low, deliberate, almost blending with the crackle of embers in the small fireplace. You lean closer, drawn by cadence rather than words, because even when the language is foreign, rhythm carries meaning. Each line spills across the room, curling around cups, rugs, and lamp flames, like smoke that refuses to dissipate. Verses travel faster than caravans. The poet speaks of rivers that vanish into deserts, of kings who trade crowns for camels, of winds that steal voices before dawn. Travelers listen, some nodding in recognition, others closing eyes to drift further into the story. You realize the poems serve multiple purposes: entertainment, moral guidance, and sometimes the oral preservation of news. A merchant could hear of a drought miles away, woven into stanzas and passed along to the next town. Historians still argue whether such poetry functioned primarily as art or as a vital communication network, but in this moment, you don't care. It's beautiful, alive, and perfectly timed with the clink of teacups. Your quirky tidbit: in some desert tea houses, poets competed for attention by hiding small charms in their verses. If a listener noticed the charm, they might receive a discount, a secret blessing, or simply bragging rights. Imagine trying to read a romantic line about lost love while simultaneously spotting a tiny talisman that could save your life. The combination of charm hunting and literary analysis sounds exhausting but exhilarating. The fire crackles and snaps, casting moving shadows on the walls. The poet gestures toward the table where maps are scattered. One verse describes a winding path from oasis to oasis, lines bending like dunes on the page. You realize that a well-chosen stanza could make or break a caravan's survival. Poetry and navigation, intertwined. A small audience gathers, drawn from merchants and pilgrims alike. One man leans over and murmurs that his grandfather recited the same lines decades ago in another tea house hundreds of miles away. The continuity is almost absurd, like a relay race carried by memory rather than parchment. Somehow, the words survive longer than roads, longer than camels, perhaps even longer than empires. You sip your tea, now lukewarm, letting the lingering spice settle on your tongue. The poet's voice becomes a thread pulling the room together, uniting strangers across different languages, religions, and pasts. Each line anchors them in the moment while pointing toward distant horizons. And then, the unusual happens. A second poet, younger and more reckless, begins an improvised verse over the first. The words clash like sparring swords, but instead of chaos, the room hums with energy. Travelers clap lightly, some laughing, some sighing in appreciation of wit and audacity. Music, poetry, and tea have merged into a single rhythm, one that measures not minutes but shared attention and shared warmth. You notice, too, that the cat has moved closer to the fire, tail flicking in quiet approval, its eyes half-lidded but fully attentive. Even the animals sense the weight of tradition in this room, this space where memory, flavor, and sound converge. By the time the poets finish, silence falls again, but it is not empty. It is a pause heavy with resonance, the kind of silence that allows your thoughts to drift back to the desert night, the caravan bells, the maps, and the scattered stars beyond the walls. For a brief moment, you are not a visitor. You are a participant in an unbroken chain, one cup, one poem, one ember at a time. The warmth of the hearth lingers as voices settle into whispers, but not all talk has died. From a shadowed corner, a few travelers huddle close, exchanging nervous glances and low murmurs that tickle the edges of your curiosity. Bandits, they say, raiders who prowl the outskirts after dark, waiting for lone camels or careless merchants. You swallow, realizing that the threat is as much a part of the tea house as the tea itself. A guard leans against the doorway, spear propped at a casual angle. He doesn't speak much, but his eyes are alert, scanning the room and the horizon beyond. In a desert where dunes shift overnight, you begin to understand the fragile balance of safety. A tea house's walls are only as strong as the people who guard them. Historians still argue whether these guards were ever effective or if their presence was largely symbolic, a psychological comfort for weary travelers. Either way, it works. Your shoulders relax fractionally, and your cup feels heavier in a reassuring way. The chatter is hushed but vivid, tales of shadowed passes and sudden raids, and you can't help picturing it. Dark figures moving like wraiths across sand, their intentions as sharp as their blades. One merchant swears that a raider once demanded a camel, then vanished into the night with nothing but a laugh. Another insists the same man returned years later, apologizing and offering tea. You smile, because of course the desert requires both caution and absurdity. Quirky tidbit: some caravans carried miniature scarecrow-like effigies of bandits, strategically placed along the desert paths. They were meant to confuse or frighten raiders into thinking the trail was already guarded. Whether it worked or not remains debated, but the mental image is enough to make you grin. Imagine a sand dune dotted with tiny clay warriors, each frowning in determination. The tea master glances toward the whispers, but he does not intervene. His movements are precise as ever, pouring tea for those seated near the hearth, cleaning cups with deliberate care. It occurs to you that this, too, is part of survival. Quiet competence, unspoken assurance, an atmosphere of control in the middle of an unpredictable world. Outside, The wind rattles the wooden shutters. Camel bells ring faintly in the distance, and you imagine raiders listening too, weighing their next move against the sound of safety just beyond the dunes. The tea house's walls, thick and sun-baked, provide a bubble of comfort, a tiny bastion against both natural and human threats. Your cup is empty now, but your mind simmers with tension and anticipation. You realize that much of the tea house's magic comes from these stories, the combination of warmth, vigilance, and whispered danger. Here, life and death dance on the edge of the flame, yet no one panics. Instead, they drink, eat, laugh softly, and wait. A lull settles over the room, punctuated only by the soft scrape of a chair, the sigh of the fire, and the distant bells. You lean back against your cushion, imagining the desert outside and the caravan trails still threading unseen beneath the night sky. The tea house is a haven, yes, but it is also a stage on which the desert's dangers play out in quiet, controlled fragments. The hush lingers, but now a new rhythm emerges, footsteps on the wooden threshold, slow and deliberate. A trader arrives, his robe dusty from miles on a northern route, a bundle slung over one shoulder. He carries not silk or spice, but stories, personal, tangled, and fragrant with human experience. He bows slightly, nods to the tea master, and settles near the hearth, careful not to disturb the delicate order of the room. You listen as he begins to speak softly, almost to himself. His words are filled with towns and rivers, with oases named for forgotten queens and wells once considered cursed. The story has no single purpose. It meanders, doubling back, jumping forward, layering mystery atop memory. You realize this is storytelling as survival, a way of passing knowledge along routes otherwise too dangerous for maps. Historians still argue whether oral accounts like these ever replaced physical records, or if they existed alongside written texts as a flexible, mutable complement. Nearby, a young woman with a small leather-bound notebook scribbles furiously. She captures phrases, gestures, odd details, names, routes, snippets of conversation. Perhaps she intends to compile a guide, or perhaps she simply cannot resist recording the ephemeral. You remember similar habits from past tea houses, travelers who wrote poems or painted small sketches, leaving traces of their presence behind like breadcrumbs for future wanderers. Quirky tidbit: some merchants and travelers reportedly carried tiny, secret books of desert etiquette, filled with symbols and codes indicating which caravan to trust or which paths were haunted. One misstep in interpretation could mean lost camels, or worse, hours lost wandering among dunes pretending they were friendly oases. You glance at your own cup, thinking it might contain less danger than those instructions. The trader pauses and takes a sip from his tea, warm and slightly bitter. He gazes out the window at the stars, noting distances and familiar constellations. Travelers like him read the heavens with the same intensity they read maps, aware that a single misjudged star could cost days of extra travel. The tea house itself seems to lean in, listening to the unfolding stories. Even the cat has shifted position, curling nearer to the hearth, tail flicking in rhythm with the trader's soft muttering. Lamps flicker gently as if agreeing with him, casting dancing shadows over rugs worn smooth by countless footsteps. You realize that the tea house is not simply a place to rest. It is a living archive, absorbing memories, fears, hopes, and small triumphs. Each arriving traveler, each whispered story, leaves a mark, however subtle, on the walls and floors. This accumulation of human experience becomes the true treasure of the place, far more enduring than spice, silk, or even gold. A gust of wind rattles the shutters. Outside, you imagine dunes rolling like slow tides, erasing footprints, swallowing landmarks, hiding dangers. Inside, the tea house remains steadfast, a nexus of warmth and knowledge, waiting for the next traveler who will add their story to the growing tapestry. You lift your cup once more, feeling its weight, feeling the warmth seep into your palms. For a moment, The desert beyond is vast and unknowable, but inside, each voice, each sip, each rustle of a rug reminds you that even in isolation, connection is possible. The night deepens, and a hush falls over the tea house, soft as the flutter of a moth's wings against a lamp. The last of the merchants have drifted into quiet conversation or sleep, their bodies slack against cushions, maps folded and tucked beside them. You notice how every object seems to hold its own memory, the chipped clay cups, the carpets with patterns worn smooth in the center, the lamps whose oil has burned through countless evenings. Each one tells a story if you pause long enough to listen. A small wind rattles the shutters. Outside, the desert is an expanse of black and silver, the moon just a crescent overhead. Camel bells echo faintly in the distance, fading as if carried off by the night itself. You sip your tea, warm, almost sweet now, its aroma curling into your nostrils. Each swallow seems to pull you deeper into the quiet intimacy of the room, a cocoon stitched from centuries of travelers seeking rest. Historians still argue whether the intimate architecture of tea houses, the sunken floors, the layered carpets, the low tables, was designed for comfort or control, for fostering conversation or maintaining order among strangers. For you, it doesn't matter. The design works. It guides the rhythm of human interaction almost imperceptibly. Even the cat, now stretched across a rug in the corner, seems part of this choreography, its tail flicking in slow sync with the fire. Quirky tidbit: some tea houses had hidden niches in walls where travelers could leave small charms, letters, or tokens for those who followed. Nobody could guarantee they'd be found, and yet the act of leaving something behind was a ritual of hope, a gesture toward connection across space and time. You glance around, imagining little tokens tucked among the carpets or behind the lamps. Perhaps one of these relics rests beneath your feet now. A monk enters quietly, carrying only a small bowl and a whispered sense of patience. He places the bowl on the table without disturbing the hush, then sits cross-legged, eyes closed, breathing in rhythm with the lamps flickering above. His presence is like a punctuation mark, subtle but decisive. You think of how travelers, merchants, musicians, and pilgrims all share this one space across decades, centuries even, each adding a layer to the invisible architecture of human experience. Somewhere near the entrance, a traveler hums a tune, the sound hesitant but persistent. The notes fold over the room, intertwining with the faint hiss of the kettle and the occasional clink of cups. Music, stories, tea, and quiet all converge in a delicate balance. It is mesmerizing how the simplest elements, flame, liquid, fabric, and voice, can orchestrate such profound calm. You lean back against your cushion, eyes drifting to the shadows dancing on the walls. Every flicker seems to carry a story, a camel trudging across a sand dune, a merchant negotiating saffron, a poet capturing the stars in ink. The tea house has become a vessel of memory, sheltering both the mundane and the extraordinary, a repository of whispers that will outlive the travelers who passed through. You feel the weight of time settle around you. Nights like this, stretched between lamp glow and desert hush, remind you that even fleeting moments can be sacred. Each breath, each sip, each quiet laugh is a thread in the tapestry of life along the Silk Roads. The tea house, in its quiet, understated way, ensures these threads are not lost. By now, the tea house is nearly silent. The embers in the hearth glow faintly, breathing orange warmth into the room. You notice the subtle details that previously went unobserved, a faint curl of smoke rising from a spent incense stick, the smooth wear of the wooden floor where countless travelers have shifted, the slight tilt of a lamp that has leaned the same way for decades. It feels as though the place itself is exhaling after a long day, settling into a rhythm of quiet endurance. A lone traveler sits near the door, a bundle of maps and notes clutched loosely in his lap. He drifts between wakefulness and sleep, lips moving as if speaking to the desert beyond the walls. Outside, the wind rattles faintly, carrying sand over dunes and whispering through distant rocks. Camel bells echo, soft and faint, as if bidding the night farewell. You sip your last cup of tea, feeling the warmth linger longer than you expected, a gentle reminder of human ingenuity and the subtle comforts of civilization in the midst of harsh landscapes. Historians still argue whether the survival of these tea houses depended more on community cooperation or sheer luck. Each night was a gamble with nature and human caprice, but somehow, they persisted, a network of rest, warmth, and knowledge connecting desert travelers across miles and generations. You realize the fragility and resilience coexisting in one space. The walls, the rugs, the lamps, the tea, they all tell stories that outlast their makers. Quirky tidbit: some travelers left behind small, almost imperceptible marks on the beams, tiny carvings, initials, symbols, so that centuries later, archaeologists or fellow wanderers might find them. The messages were sometimes mundane: a name, a date, a location. Sometimes cryptic: a tiny drawing of a camel, a star, a sun. You imagine a future wanderer tracing those marks with a finger, feeling a connection through centuries, a quiet recognition of shared experience. The tea master moves softly between tables, extinguishing one lamp at a time. The air cools further, carrying faint traces of roasted leaves and distant desert winds. You lean back, letting your shoulders sink into the cushion. Outside, dunes shift silently under the moon, carrying away footprints, but inside, the tea house preserves history in more subtle ways, in quiet observation, ritualized tea, shared stories, and the memory of human warmth. You think about all the travelers who have passed through here, the merchants, the monks, the musicians, the pilgrims. Every cup poured, every whispered story, every laugh and sigh has left an echo. It is humbling to realize that the space you occupy is a living archive of survival, culture, and simple humanity, stitched together by quiet gestures repeated over centuries. The walls seem to hum with memory, a gentle resonance that mirrors the pulse of your own heartbeat. As you slowly settle into the dim glow, you feel the weight of night pressing softly against the windows, carrying a comforting promise that even in the vastness of desert and time, there exist small, steadfast refuges where warmth, wisdom, and connection persist. You take one last slow sip, feeling the heat of the tea mingle with the glow of the lamps, and allow yourself to surrender fully to the stillness. The room is quieter now than it has been all evening. Even the cat has moved to the hearth, curling into a tight circle, tail flicking once in acknowledgement before stilling completely. You notice the subtle scent of aged wood, tea, and faint desert dust lingering in the air. The tea house has become a cocoon of warmth and memory, each element holding centuries of quiet witness, each sound a gentle echo of lives past and present. You breathe slowly, letting your thoughts drift. The desert beyond is vast, unknowable, yet here, inside, the world feels contained, safe. You imagine the dunes rolling silently under moonlight, stars glimmering faintly above, and know that travelers are moving through them even now, following the same paths, seeking the same warmth you have just experienced. There is a kind of magic in that continuity, a reassurance that human experience threads through time like a delicate tapestry. Your body relaxes into the cushions, heavy but not weighed down, carried by the rhythm of the tea house itself. The faint hiss of a dying kettle, the low hum of embers, the occasional whisper of wind through a shutter. All of it is soft, gentle, and infinite. You feel yourself merging with the space, as though the centuries of travelers, monks, and merchants have built a shared presence around you. The last warmth of your tea lingers on your tongue. You let your eyes drift closed, surrendering fully to the soft darkness and the memory of distant stars. Outside, the desert stretches on without judgment. Inside, you are cradled in human ingenuity, warmth, and connection, a quiet affirmation that even the loneliest places can hold life, stories, and solace.